Now, I don't know how long this is. So I'm thinking it's under an hour. But at any rate, sometimes we run over on these Coffee with Bobs. They last a pretty good while. I have an appointment at 10, but anyway, we'll see. This thing may not last too long anyway. The reason we're talking about this is because before Christmas last year, Congress passed what they call the Secure Act, and they messed up IRA planning. And specifically, what I'm talking about in messing up IRA planning was that for 20 years, people that had individual retirement accounts and were thinking about their estate planning. Well, the idea was if something was left in your IRA when you pass away, and you named your kids or your kids' trusts as the beneficiary, your kids could take distributions out over their life expectancy. And so this meant that potentially if the IRA could grow for the kid for a number of years, your children could take out the required minimum distribution, but the required amount was small because the life expectancy period was so long. And so it just seemed like a very desirable setup for helping your family in the future. It was a desirable setup. It was called a stretch IRA. So today we're going to talk about the impact on your planning. So to start with, if you're not particularly concerned about your kids being able to inherit and to be able to make the best use of that money, some people just say, well, it's up to my kids at that point. That's not an unreasonable position, but that's not really where I'm coming from today. From the estate planning standpoint, it depends on what your vision and my vision of how we want this to work for our kids and how long we want the life savings that we're leaving to our children to last for them. So it's about our vision for this. And in my view, the best approach for families is to view family wealth and the family asset basis as a huge blessing to the family. And so the family needs to create a family tradition about stewardship and annual distributions from those assets. And what you want your responsible children and descendants to do is view them as stewards of this money that they are going to receive from you, and that they should preserve it over the generations and make annual distributions every year. So that's my vision. I should mention that as part of this, you should have gotten a PDF that has a version of these slides on it. So if you want to make notes or if you want to come back and review something that I've said, you'll have a copy of the information that's on the slides. Okay, so how do we accomplish this? Well, the first thing is you got to have a system for investing that embodies the best thinking about investing for the long term. And the reason that you need this is because you need to convince yourself, your spouse, and your kids that you have a good answer for how this should be done. Because the world of investing is just a world of confusion. And mostly it results in suboptimal results for families. And that's part of the reason I am so invested, so frustrated, if you will, by this, because I've had a ringside seat during my estate planning career here, watching clients, and the short answer is that what's possible and what most families achieve, it's just we don't get the possible benefit that we could if we used a better system and had a better understanding about how to get good returns from our investments. So the family has to know that the system they're going to use works. And also, by having this sort of resolution in the family, it keeps it keeps us on the right path for handling investments over the long term. So how do you implement the system? Well, you got to develop the family belief that maintaining and growing the family asset base is a great idea. You got to convince the family that you're using the smartest system you could find to grow those family assets. And then you need to test it in operation to show the family that it'll work. So, so how are we going to do this? So let me just talk about it just for a second. A lot of times there is, in most families, there's not that good a conversation between the spouses and then the kids about the best way to invest and about what the goals should be in handling the family asset base. So just to continue with this idea for a bit more, just keep in mind that if a family does not have investment assets that produce annual returns, then the family has to make money every day, every week, every month, every year. You have to turn the crank. That's what you did, during your working life. You worked every day because you did not have an asset base that was providing income to you. For most of us, we accumulated this by main force, and we had to go to work every day to feed our family, to create our savings, to create the lifestyle that we want. If a person or a family is going to have any additional resources, ongoing resources, they have to have an asset base, and that asset base needs to be maintained and grow, and it has to make distributions every year. So this is not intuitively obvious to people. You might say, well, that sounds pretty good to me. But it's not intuitively obvious. It's not going to cross your kid's mind that that's the way to handle it unless you set this up. Now, another thing I just want to mention it because it's so intriguing to me. When we talk about convincing the family of this and talking to the family, just think about this, that for you and me and for the whole world, everything is about imagination, and then the imagination to think about something, the discipline to go ahead and implement this thing that we have imagined, and in many cases the courage to undertake it and to pursue it. And if you think about it, the obvious example, let's take Walt Disney. Essentially, this man imagines this business idea, this very creative idea, and carries it out, this enormous thing that Walt Disney created. Or Edison in his inventions and all the things he did, the technological innovations that Edison did that just changed the country and the world from his own imagination, and then the discipline and the resolve and the courage to carry it out. Now, you and I are not on the scale with Edison or Walt Disney, and you could go on and on. I mean, like Elon Musk right now, he's a very strange character, very different personality, and yet it looks like he is revolutionizing the way that cars are built and designed. Quite an achievement out of what? Out of his mind and his will. Well, you and I are not probably on that scale, to put it mildly, but we still have the same, in our own lives, we imagined what we would do, and then we tried to carry it out. And that's how things are created. And so if you're going to create a family tradition, then you have to imagine it, and then you have to carry it out, and you have to convey that to the people you care about. You have to speak it into existence. You imagine and then you speak it into existence and you show it how it works. And so if we're going to have this great family tradition of creating an family asset base that can go on for potentially indefinitely, then we've got to think in those terms.
Mr. Vaughn,
Aha.
The topic that you're talking about is very interesting. And can we mix it with the benefits of having a trust fund along the way?
That's a good point. It may talk about that a little bit. Like I said, I'm working on this, and I may add to it in this presentation. But if we have time, maybe we can just address your interest there, or see where I need to add something as we go along. Let me see if I can get this to advance. Okay, so here's another thing, another concept that I want you to think about today. Distribution versus accumulation. So during your working life, you accumulate money, right? You accumulate savings. This is the accumulation phase. You're not going to have a retirement if you don't save and accumulate during your working years. Now, once we get to retirement, for some, making distributions from their retirement just comes naturally. It comes most naturally to those people who absolutely need a certain amount of money out of their retirement savings every month to supplement the money that they have from Social Security and pensions and other sources. They absolutely have to have this money, and they're worried about that it may not last. So for those people, this whole problem comes naturally. However, interestingly enough, in my experience, for other people who see that they have more than their investment assets, they have more income, taking their Social Security, pension, plus maybe their required minimum distributions. If they take that, they say, well, that's all I need. And yes, this other is available. And yes, I could take distributions, but I don't need it. So I don't think I want to do it. So here's what a lot of people do. They say, they're worried. They say, if we start taking distributions, we're going to run out of money. And so I'd just rather not start that unless I have to. They say, well, it's more prudent to keep saving for the future. You just don't know what's going to happen. The world's uncertain. There's all this confusion going on in the economy, and I just don't know what's going to happen. It's more prudent if I don't have to take distributions this year, or I don't need any additional distributions. Well, we'll just keep saving. And you say, I worked hard to get this and save it. It feels good to have a growing account balance. So a lot of people say, I'm happy that I got $1 million or 2 million or 10 or whatever it is, and I like to see it growing, and I like to think about it, and so that just feels good in its own right. And finally, if I don't use it, well, then it goes to the kids, and it'll just be a bigger thing for them, and they'll live happily ever after. So the point is that a lot of people don't really take this distribution business very seriously if they have assets that if they feel like they don't need to. Okay, so I want to challenge that, okay, for a number of reasons. So let me challenge you with this. Let's take this example. The husband and wife have $1 million in an IRA, and they're spending the required minimum distributions, the RMDs, in addition to Social Security and pension or retirement income that they receive. This amount seems very adequate to their needs. They have another $1 million in other assets. They're not spending any of that. They're in that mode where we don't need it, we'll just let it grow. Now, if they had confidence in their investment system, they could take 3% of that $1 million in other assets and distribute $30,000 to themselves or their kids or their church every year forever. So, if we don't take it, you need to ask yourself, how could the true purpose of your life savings be to never use it? or that the use of it is off in the misty future. It's just wishful, kind of wishful thinking. Well, if it's still there when we're, gone, we didn't use it, then our kids will live happily ever after with it. How can that be? The point of your family assets is to live more securely and abundantly once you get to the distribution phase. What sense is it to put off this use? It is an opportunity denied, postponed, and never to return. Ask your church or your charity if they'd rather have a gift this year or maybe get one after you're gone. Ask your kids if they would rather have a distribution this year rather than maybe in the misty future. Ask yourself if you had that, in example, $30,000, maybe you take another cruise, maybe you buy a cuter car, maybe, whatever. The idea is to live more securely and abundantly once you receive this. Now, also, the importance of this is that once your children receive an inheritance, unless you've set the stage for it, the idea of taking 3% a year out of this asset base will never cross their minds. In other words, what happens for even large estates, in most cases, is that once the children receive it, then across their mind comes different things that they want to buy. And this is an array. So they first say, well, we need a bigger home in a better neighborhood. So then we'll take some of the money out of this and we'll buy that. And then, well, we need a new car. And so what happens is that the money is frittered away in one-time purchases and is gone pretty quick. Okay, so the concept is not necessarily just about you and your spouse, because family wealth isn't going to last long unless you train your family on how it should work and why this is a better idea. Your kids must understand the best way to handle their inheritance. And like I said, the idea of making annual distributions of 3 or 4% of the value of their inheritance and the idea that there's a right way to invest will never cross their minds. The game is lost at the outset. You have no family tradition. The family has got to speak this into existence. They've got to show that they have a system that is desirable and should be maintained unless there's a clear evidence that there's a better way to handle it, the investing system. And they've got to restrict themselves to distributions that will not deplete the family wealth. So to create a great and lasting family tradition, the mother and father need to speak this into existence and demonstrate how it works. Okay, so what's the application of these ideas? Well, because remember we're talking about IRAs and the Secure Act. And so how did the new Secure Act screwed this up? The idea of the stretch IRA was messed up because under the new rules, an inherited IRA has to be distributed within 10 years. That's the best case. If depending on other circumstances, the period of distribution could be from 0, that's a very bad case, or more likely it would be between 5 and 10 years rather than 10 years. Also keep in mind, under the new rules, you don't have to take out a certain amount each year, but you have to have it all out by the 10th year or the last year of the available distribution period. So the example here, daughter is 50 when she inherits her mother's IRA. She could take distributions for 34.2 years under the old law. The IRA could grow tax deferred, and she could pay taxes only in the amount that she took out each year. She could take out more, but she could take out as little. If you have 34.2 years, that's essentially, it's 1/34th, which is about 3% a year. So the first year she would take out 3%. The next year she would take out 1/33rd, 133.2, 1 divided by 33.2. And then the next year it would go down by another, it would be 1 32.2. Okay, so the factor goes down by 1 year as every year advances. But it's still a very long time that she would have to distribute it. That is no more. Okay, so now it doesn't work very well. So your daughter inherits $1 million traditional IRA from you. She's going to have to take it all out within 10 years. The distributions will end up on her tax return if the IRA goes directly to her. If it goes to her IRA trust, part may end up on trust tax return and part on her tax return. So the taxation of this, well, the other point on here, it says distributions will be greater than 3 or 4% and taxes will be owed. And this adds to the confusion in managing the asset and keeping distributions at the correct amount. It also means that there's going to be investment decisions that the daughter is going to have to make as each of these distributions comes out of the IRA. Okay, so one, she can't distribute it over her life expectancy. She's going to have to take out more than 3 or 4%. She's going to have a tax issue with it, and she's going to have to decide how much goes back into the family, into her inheritance investment base, and how it's going to be invested. So all of this is, additional places where your system is more cumbersome to manage, needs more discipline from your kids, and where the taxation is much more undesirable than it was before, because it's going to get taxed faster, and that means probably at higher rates. So if your children want to make the system work, they can, but it's just much more awkward to do. So now this IRA as an inherited item is just not near as desirable as it was before. Okay, what if the beneficiary is not responsible? All right, so if the beneficiary is not responsible, then what you're going to be doing is you're going to name his or her IRA trust or legacy trust as the beneficiary of this inherited IRA. And then some other family member or corporate trustee is going to manage this for the beneficiary. And so if the beneficiary isn't responsible or can't be counted on to follow the plan to their own detriment, then the problem with the way that the IRA trusts are set up right now in most of your estate planning documents, the beneficiary has the right to take any distributions that come out of the IRA. So the irresponsible beneficiary could simply tell the trustee, I want all of the money that you distributed this year from the IRA. And so that in fact they could deplete this thing contrary to the family's intent. Now we can change the way the trust reads so that that's not the case, but the reason that's in there was to make sure that it was to meet IRS rules so we could get a stretch IRA. But if you're trying to control it for less responsible family members or younger family members by using some other family member to control it or a corporate trustee, we need to make sure that the IRA trust doesn't allow the beneficiary just to deplete the money. Now it says, and the trustee may have less than 10 years to withdraw it. There's a bunch of IRA rules. I don't want to get too wrapped around the axle, but when you're running the IRA through a trust, if it doesn't meet certain requirements, you won't get the full 10 years. And so this is something we should address almost on a case-by-case basis if you're concerned about it. Okay, so what should we consider doing because of this awkwardness? And there's a lot of factors going here. I'm not saying one size fits all. Some families might say, well, I'm not going to do anything about it. It's okay the way it is. They can pull this off or not. Or that you can say that I think my family can figure out this. We'll talk about it a bit. But are there other more proactive things that you might want to do? So the conclusion you can say about the new rules is they create higher taxes over a shorter period, and it complicates the handling of the IRA account for the beneficiary trustee, and it does not fit with the idea of making annual distributions of 3 or 4% from the family asset base to family members or descendants or beneficiaries. It doesn't fit that mode. Okay, so what can we do about it? Okay, so one thing is we could use more of the IRA assets for current living expenses. So the husband and wife could change their mode. Then again, this depends on the size and what kinds of investment assets you have. In some cases, the mom and dad could just decide that they'll use more of the IRA assets for their own needs, and that because that's less desirable asset to pass on, and that the one that's more likely to be a legacy asset that they want to get to the kids are the easier to manage after-tax investment assets. So an after-tax investment asset is one where you used your money after you paid taxes on it, regular money, not IRA money, and you invested that, or that's money that was invested in a rent house, and you sold it and bought mutual funds or whatever, put it into your investment base. So it's after-tax money, or much more desirable from a lot of as far as an inheritance asset. Now, the other thing is you could convert a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA. Okay, so the first question is, why would that be a good idea? Well, the first thing is the husband and wife do not have to take required minimum distributions from Roths. So now that potentially, if you thought that some of your IRA assets, that can be part of your permanent investment base, and that then you don't have to take RMDs from it. So that complication is out with Roths. For the husband and wife, you don't have to take RMDs. Now, when it gets to your kids, they will have RMDs, but it's not taxable. It's tax-free. Okay, the inherited beneficiaries will have 10 years or less to distribute the Roth account, but growth in the Roth is tax-free and distributions are tax-free. So it's not creating some tax complication for your children in managing this thing. And so it's still perfectly consistent. It's not creating all the decisions and administrative issues that the traditional IRA is creating. So it's much smoother, easier to handle, and it's got this huge advantage that as long as it's in the Roth shell, it's growing tax deferred. Okay, so it's much simpler for the beneficiary trustee to manage for the long term. So what's the rub? Well, the rub is the amount of tax the owner will pay. Right, that's the rub. So you can convert any amount out of your traditional IRA into the Roth. The issue is when you do that, you're going to owe taxes on the amount that came out of the traditional IRA. Okay, so let's look at this for a second. So in 2017, the Trump administration lowered the tax rates, and I think they increased the distance between the different bands, but I'm not positive about that. At any rate, I think that's right. But at any rate, the bands are broad. So let me just show you what I mean here. So on this chart, on the left-hand side, you got the tax rate, and then the first column is for single individuals, and the next column is for married filing joint returns. So let me just look at that center column. You can pick whatever you want, but whatever you need. But I'm going to focus on the center one just to talk about this for a second. So what it's saying is that if you earn over a zero amount, you're going to pay 10% up to $19,750. And then if you earn more than $19,750, but less than $80,250 in retirement as your adjusted gross income, you're going to pay 12%. So 12% up to $80,250. And then if you in your retirement are your adjusted gross income is between 80,250 and 171,050, you're going to pay 22% is your marginal tax rate. Okay. So let's just say that the retired couple had adjusted gross income of about 100,000. Well, then they could potentially convert 70,000 of their traditional IRA to a Roth, and they would stay in the same marginal income tax bracket of 22%. Now, keep in mind, the marginal tax bracket is not the only way to think about your taxes, or maybe even the best way, because you have all these exemptions. And so actually, you don't pay 22%. You, after your deductions, you're going to pay less than 22%. Okay, so your effective tax rate is going to be less than your marginal tax rate. Okay, so you say, all right, I could convert $70,000 of a traditional IRA this year, and I would have to pay something less than 22%. And you could look at like your last year's tax return and figure out, just take your tax over your AGI or over your either your AGI or your gross income, depending on how you look at it, and figure out what your effective tax rate is. You'll find it's not as high as this marginal tax rate. But at any rate, so you're going to say, well, all right, I can convert $70,000 into a Roth this year, and I'm not going to get above. It's going to be less than 22% tax rate. And so then ask yourself, if my kids got $70,000 or 35, I haven't counted how many kids they got, if they got it on their tax return, what tax bracket would they be in? And so you could ask them straight away, or you may have an indication. And also keep in mind that when they're going to pay it is after you're gone, and that may be years and years from now. And whatever their station in life now, it may be conceivably be much improved, and they could be receiving much higher income. Also, if they're in high tax states like California, they not only have this federal income tax, but then they have whatever 13% state income tax, which may add to the tax burden. And not only that, you are getting to pick how much you are going to transfer each year. But remember, they only have 10 years to take this money out at the max, and so they're going to get hit with a higher. They're going to have to, if they're going to take it out over the 10 years, which would seem like the most tax efficient way to do it, with all the tax costs within 10 years, it's going on their tax return. So now you could be able to maybe weigh in your own mind the desirability of you going ahead and starting to convert some of your IRA to a Roth. Okay, so what's the course of action? Consider what your children's marginal tax rate may be if they inherit a taxable IRA from you. Consider whether your children must also pay state income tax. Decide if it makes sense to begin converting some or all of the taxable retirement plans while keeping yourself in the lowest possible tax bracket. Pay the tax, invest the remainder as part of your long-term investment system. You can still use the money if you and your spouse need it. So that would be an alternative course of action, a way of improving the ability of you and your kids to manage this long term. It may reduce the taxes, and it may fit well with what your long-term goals are. Okay, so this my presentation today really has several calls to action for successful family legacy. What you want to do is you want to create a family tradition about your investment system and the value of permanent family wealth. Like I said, this idea of taking 3 or 4% from an asset base is unlikely to cross your children's minds unless you set the stage for it, you talk about it, and you show them how this works. And then I'm saying begin making annual distributions so that your family will come to see the power and the feasibility of this idea. So let's see, somebody's calling. I can't tell what's going on. I think it's Skype call. It'll probably be so why would you begin making annual distributions? The reason is that you and your family need to have confidence that this is a sensible way to handle it and that it can be done. If you never really do it and your kids don't know about it, this is never going to happen. You've got to speak it into existence, talk it into existence, and show that it works. And so the idea of this is to show the family that the annual distributions of the maximum amount that will still allow the family assets to increase over time is the best way to handle their inheritance. Okay. I don't think this is intuitively obvious to people at all. If you tell people, hey, you could take 3% out of your $1 million, they'll say, that's not very much. I'd rather, I should buy a rent house or get a new house or something. Surely there's a better thing to do it. Well, actually, that taking 3% from the asset base or 4% from the asset base is the best way to handle it, would be my argument. This is the way to maintain and grow this over time. Now, in other presentations, my obstacles presentation, one of the things that I talk about is the fact that most families cannot get a successful return on their investments. And so this really, I think people are unprepared to face this because, if you're investing, this year is an anomaly, but last year was a very good year for the stock market. If you were invested in U.S. large stocks, you made the value of your account went up dramatically last year. The Vanguard S&P 500 index fund went up 31% last year. 31%. So you say, what are you talking about? 3%, 4%. Well, the problem is that is very. We remember that we got this huge return and we think somehow that is typical. Well, if you took that same Vanguard S&P 500 index fund and took it for the last 20 years, the average annual return is 6%. Okay. And that's a proxy for U.S. stocks, U.S. large stocks. And when I say that, you are probably invested in U.S. large stocks, period. Okay, so that's so anyway, the point is that we get confused because we have good years and we seem to remember that, but over the long term, the amount that your investments can grow is not going to be 31% a year. And so the goal, the goal is that you need to have an investment system that offers you the promise, or not the promise, the reasonable expectation that the return could be in the 6-7% per year, not every year, but over the long term, and that the distribution rate is less than the average increase in value. Because your family asset base needs to grow and it needs to create a surplus that can provide distributions every year. So you need to teach your family how this should work and why this is so desirable for them. If they don't understand this, they don't have confidence in it, it's hard to see how this can be made to work. And my whole experience as a estate planner is that most families have a hard time in passing on family wealth effectively, in managing assets during their retirement and growing them, and in having a concept that offers the promise of what I'm suggesting. So what I would suggest is that you come join me on this journey. You know, this is I'm on the same idea that I'm talking about. I'm trying to implement this for my family. Many of you are trying to implement this for your family. And so what we want to do is put an investment system to work. And we want to analyze your situation and see if, you know, is what you're doing making sense? How can we improve it? Do you have a system? You got to have a system because you got to convince your spouse and your kids that they need to follow the system. There's a lot of details in budgeting for retirement and dealing with those details. And for many families, there's an issue that we want to think about how we can maintain effective control of family assets so that the responsible family members are handling those assets. And so there's some techniques that may be very desirable for, you know, each family member can't manage their own part of the inheritance very well, and we need to have responsible family members doing that. And then, of course, planning for distributions and how to handle that, and how to handle it when the markets are up and down and so forth. So, so that's my call to action for you. Come talk to me. We need an investment system. We need to think about how we're going to put this into play. And usually families have a lot of questions about it. And of course, the IRA is just like, okay, now we got this new problem about how to integrate this into our system and what's the best way to handle it. So that's my talk of the morning. And I'm going to stop now. Let's see, we got a few minutes to ask questions and stuff. Let me stop the screen so we can see each other better. Alrighty, I'm back on this. I stopped the screen share. Anybody got particular questions or thoughts on that, or something not clear?
Well, it was pretty interesting. But for me, I'm got about 10 years to get to retirement. I would hope to see or hear in your next presentation probably about what I mentioned, the benefit of having a trust fund and having my assets in a trust fund versus having it in my name or a corporation or something.
Yeah.
How that would help me out.
Well, let me talk about one thing along that line that comes up all the time. So with IRAs or 401ks, you know, if you're married, you leave your spouse as the primary. And then if your kids are grown, you can just leave it to the kids directly. And in terms of simplicity and being able to get the 10-year distribution period and so forth, that's the simplest way to handle it. And also, if you talk to financial advisors, other financial advisors, frequently they'll say, you don't want to run the IRA through a trust, it's too complicated. Just leave it straight out to your kids, if they're assuming they're responsible. So there's a considerable amount of just aversion to the idea that we're going to run an IRA or 401k through a trust ultimately. However, what I just stated obscures a bunch of points. Okay, the first point is, if you have little kids or young adults and it's not time for them to manage money, or if they're under 18, they can't even own property, so you have to have somebody else manage it. Well, then it's got to go through a trust. So if you have young children or young adults, you can't name at your work your 401k and your spouse and then name your little kids as beneficiary. It's just going to court. They can't inherit. It's just going to cause your family to go to court and get all embroiled in that. You've got to name a trust as the beneficiary, the contingent beneficiary on your 401k or IRA. If you have little kids, if you have young adults that you don't want to manage the money, or if you have kids who you just don't think they're ever going to be responsible enough, or that's just not their forte, managing money, and you want somebody else to do it, then you're going to run it through a trust. Okay, so that's a whole bunch of reasons why somebody would choose a trust. Now, here's another reason why you choose a trust, even if your kids were responsible. even if your kids are responsible, if you instead of having the IRA or 401k after you're gone go directly to your responsible kid, instead of that, you have it go to an IRA trust for them. The advantage is that if they get divorced, the property in that IRA is not going to be community property under Texas law. And so it provides divorce protection for your kids in the event, they inherit this and they were married and then they later divorce. Then that's a huge protection for that IRA. Also, your IRA trust can say that if your son or daughter passes away, that the IRA is going to go to their kids, your grandkids, and not to their spouse. Whereas if you name them directly, they can name their spouses as the beneficiary rather than your grandkids. So for a lot of families, the use of the IRA trust is highly desirable. And there's one more thing. Okay, in Texas, IRAs and 401ks and Roths, inherited IRAs, they're all protected from creditors. So if your son or daughter later inherits this thing and then gets sued, IRAs are off limits. Okay. But in other states, that's not true. Okay. So if you put that IRA so that rather than going straight to your kid, it goes through the kid's trust, then that is going to offer protection from lawsuit type creditors for the IRA if your kid lives in another state. Okay, so that's a whole bunch of reasons why you might choose to have the to run an IRA or a 401k through an IRA trust that's part of your estate planning, rather than name the beneficiary directly. Does that make sense? Did I say that clear?
Yes. And if we step back one step, well, I don't have any kids, so I'm not worried about anybody inheriting anything from me. The only one inheriting anything from me is my 4-pound chihuahua. So but I want to see how a trust fund would help me when I get to retirement age. Having my assets in a trust fund, does it really make a difference in how I get, let's say, Medicare, Social Security, anything else?
No. Okay. So you say, well, if you have now, are you married?
No.
Okay. So the first thing is that a lot of the reasons why other people would create trusts aren't useful to you. When you create a living trust, it doesn't provide asset protection for you. So that's really not helping. If you're in a Texan, you already have a lot of asset protection because, like I said, your IRAs and 401ks are already asset protected from lawsuit type creditors. Your house is protected from creditors. All your guns, jewelry, household items, and your chihuahua are protected, and your car is protected. And so the only thing that's not protected would be after-tax assets like CDs, savings accounts, and stuff that aren't in an IRA or 401k. That would be the unprotected stuff.
How about rental houses?
Yeah, so or rent houses. If they're owned in your name, wouldn't be protected. But at any rate, so a lot of living trust doesn't provide asset protections. That's not an issue, and a lot of the reasons why other people who are married and have kids might create trusts aren't part of your problem. Okay, so why would you select a trust? Well, you might say, I don't want to select one. But if you were going to do it, here's why you do it. You'd say, the problem is that if I become disabled, whoever it is that's going to back you up and take care of your affairs, they would be a lot better off if you had a trust and your assets were in a trust. It would make it easier for them to care for you if you became disabled. And it would be easier for them to settle your estate if you passed away. Now, so here's what I would think in your case, this is kind of one over the world, and I may not have the details at all, just based on what you said. From your standpoint, you would just do a will package at this stage, okay? And you wouldn't really consider doing a trust until you got older and were more worried about being disabled. and who was going to take care of you. If you're a single person, and then once you get up in years, the disability is the big problem. Who is going to take care of me and mine until I leave this earthly veil? That's the question, right? And so you don't want to put that person in too big of a jam. And the trust is a good way to handle. It's the best way to handle disability. The best way. Yeah, good question though. I'm glad you asked that, because it kind of gives shape to this, and it also shows some angles on the trust planning, IRA planning. Yeah, anybody else got a question or thought? You're free to disagree with me. Now, people could argue about one, that yes, you should start distributions. These are two different things. We got an accumulation phase, we got a distribution phase. And I'm telling you, at least my contention is that at some point in your retirement, you need to say, hey, I'm in the distribution phase. And if I had confidence in what I'm doing, I would take 3% because I know that this can work. Well, most people don't have that confidence. Well, we need to get a system that gives us this confidence. Let me give you one more example here before I run out of time.
Well, before you do that, there's a question that came through the chat screen.
Okay, good.
It says, I will become the trustee for a beneficiary that is not responsible. I'm looking for an alternative to keeping distributions in the trust and paying higher taxes. And
yeah, good question. So that's going to hinge on having efficient investments in the trust. It's possible to have large sums of money in a trust and have it be tax efficient. Okay, in other words, you're just not paying a lot of additional taxes over and above what would be incurred if it was not in a trust. So this is about the selection of and management of the investment assets so you don't create unnecessary taxation. And so I'll be glad to talk to you at more length about that, but it's possible to set up a huge investment portfolio with very low taxes. And I'm not talking about using tax-free municipal bonds or some deal like that. Tax-free municipal bonds can never provide you with the family with enough income to sustain 3%, 4% distributions every year and still grow over time. It won't work. So that's not a lot of people think, well, I'll just do tax-free bonds or something. That's no solution to this problem at all. You need to invest in a way that doesn't generate unnecessary taxation.
can you run two trusts, one for the IRA and one for the other assets that aren't in the IRA?
Yes. Yeah.
And
that's very common with our planning. It's actually, when it's implemented, that is very common. Yeah.
Can you contribute to an irrevocable trust when you are the beneficiary?
Well, you could, but you probably wouldn't want to as a general rule. And the reason is that remember typically if you are the beneficiary of an IRA, of an irrevocable trust, it's providing asset protection for whatever assets are in that. But if you put your own assets in there, it confuses that. And so if there was a future lawsuit, it might confuse it. The way that, and maybe this is too brief an answer, but for people that have an irrevocable trust and they want to get more money into it, the classic way is to set up an arrangement where the irrevocable trust buys some asset that will appreciate dramatically in the future. So that's one way. There's a lot of angles on that, and people have looked at it. So it can't be answered in a few sentences. Probably we'd have to look at your situation, exactly what the terms of the trust are, and what you're trying to do. But there are ways to do it, but you generally don't want to just plop money into it because it's going to confuse the asset protection properties of it. Good question, though. Okay, let's see. I'm down to 2 minutes, so I was going to just mention very briefly that this idea of the 3% distributions, I have been doing this with my mother's trust. My mother passed away in 1998, and so her trust pays 3% to my sister each year, a total of 3%, not 3% to each of us, total of 3% each year. This has been going on for now 20 years, 21 years, 22 years. And so this is a long-term thing. And during that period, the value of those assets has risen substantially, and the distributions have continued every year. So this is definitely feasible if you have a good system. And it's feasible even in a times, this period that I'm talking about has been very unhappy for investment assets. Remember, we had the tech crash in 2002. We had 2008, that big crash, and the markets were down for a number of years. So this is a feasible thing. It's desirable for families. It's something to think deeply about. All righty, guys. I'm gonna close up. If you have other questions, or if for Mary, we'll follow up. And I hope this was helpful to you guys, and hope to see you on other presentations. We'll hope to do a lot of Zoom presentations this summer. So thanks a million. I'm gonna leave here.
All right.
Talk to y'all later.
Bye.
Thank you. And we're going to send this video out over the email. If you want to review it, you absolutely can. And if you have any other questions, you could send them back in an email, and we'll get them answered. If you wanted to set up a time to speak individually with Mr. Bond or Mr. Brown, you can let me know that also, and I'll get time scheduled, okay?
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, have a great day.
You too.